Thank you. First of all, I'd like to really tell you how impressed I am with what I've seen about ATREE, from not just what you have achieved in these last 25 years, but the new generation of scholars that you are preparing, all so excited, so energetic. It's quite an inspiration, actually. So I should really thank you for it. Maybe there is hope for the world after all. Okay? And happy birthday. What I'm going to do is talk about first of all, where I come from. I started out life as a physicist and an engineer, moved on to economics, each time realizing that those disciplines were not part of the solution, but often part of the problem. Went on into social anthropology. And right now, I'm in the middle of the philosophy of science and sociology of technology. And these are some of the books that tell you where I'm come from and going to. Especially right now, I'm in the midst of this Nexus debate. That is a sequel to the integrated water resource management debate that we had in the past, which has its strengths and weaknesses, and which I'll briefly get into. Now, I use a kind of social science called cultural theory. Okay. The formal name for it is Neo-Durkheimian institutionalism of plural rationalities, but nobody can pronounce that. And I was surprised yesterday to get this book, Rohini Nilkani, on Bazar Samaj Sarkar. It's so close to cultural theory, at least the title. We have problems with Samaj because Samaj for us is more abhiyan, social activism, but it's very, very close to the kind of social science that we do. It was started out by, the late Professor Dame Mary Douglas. I worked with her for about 18 or 19 years in my process of becoming a, cultural theorist and social anthropologist. Now, what I am going to do is essentially talk about, give you two waterscape examples from Nepal of how they are stressed, and stress has moved into insults. Okay. And I'll use that basically to, again, caution you, as yesterday Nitin Sarkar did with, cute sounding but really facile scientific paradigms that drive the wrong kind of research and policy. He talked about the conservation of why we're doing conservation the wrong way. We had a similar stuff in the Himalaya. It's called THED, the Theory of Himalayan Environmental Degradation, that thankfully in 1986 in a conference in New York, upstate in Mohonk, it was debunked. The idea was that, and it formulated policies and continued to distort policy till today, which is that, these poor and fecund Himalayan farmers multiply like rabbits, and then they go uphill to fragile areas, cut trees and all that, cause landslides and flooding in Bangladesh. Well, for one thing, when farmers can't farm in their small farms, they don't go uphill. There's nothing there but rock and ice. They go down to Kathmandu, they come even to Bangalore. We have one of the largest Nepali communities here, I understand, to the Gulf and elsewhere. They don't go uphill. So, theory of Himalayan degradation it guided policy, it guided all foreign aid agencies, and for all the wrong reasons, But then came something else from society, which was community forestry, where communities were allowed to own their own forests, still owned by the government, but point is they could have long-term lease, and they practiced their own social fencing. It didn't require physical fence. And today in Nepal, we have far more forest cover than, frankly, we ever did in our recent history. Okay. Which tells you that, we really need to rethink development as we have received the wisdom. I call it challenging development orthodoxy. And the mantra, the cultural theory mantra for doing that is, in a very simple phrase from my late friend Steve Rayner of Oxford, wicked problems, uncomfortable knowledge, clumsy solutions. So as researchers, we are here and we are true to ourselves when we address these wicked problems like water, climate change, energy. These are all wicked problems because they don't even have a common definition of what the problem is. We disagree on the definition. And when we disagree on the definition, you can rest assured we'll disagree even more in the solutions. So that can only be addressed through uncomfortable knowledge and leading to clumsy solutions, not neat solutions. Neat solutions that we are taught in engineering schools actually are rigid and they will collapse at the first sign of stress, whereas clumsy solutions are resilient. Okay? And there's a book by that name, Clumsy Solutions for a Complex World. I have a chapter in it. You can look at it. So the idea is, this is the first one I'm going to be talking about. This is, I used to live very close to this place in North Kathmandu. 30 years ago, it was the picture on the left, you see, rice fields. The Dhobikhola Fant is the tributary of the Bagmati River that flows through Kathmandu. It was green fields. Today, what you have, picture taken by me from the same place just some time back on the right side, packed with houses. Now, how did that happen? And what is really going on? Now, Kathmandu, we heard today also, and the seminars have been exciting and really interesting. This urbanization that's going on, this mad urbanization, and it's not just Kathmandu, it's other parts of Nepal, other parts, even Bangalore as we know. It's going on crazy, and in that, the social dynamics behind it is poorly addressed, even more poorly understood. What happened in Nepal at that point was that there was a breakdown of the old political order by about the 1980s. And the state had kind of lost control to market forces. That was the time when the World Bank and the IMF were pushing structural adjustment on the country and so on and so forth. Okay? As a result, the land suddenly, rather remaining as the, producing food, we were told that, forget it, privatize, and, food can always be imported much cheaper from God knows where else. Okay. Now, that was one of the first mistakes. Okay. So, suddenly land became, instead of growing cauliflowers and rice, started growing houses. Okay. Now, this process accelerated with the Maoist insurgency and the insecurity that people felt who were living outside of Kathmandu in the villages. Those who had money, those who didn't, they migrated off to the Gulf or wherever. But those who had money sold whatever they could and bought, miserable plots of land all over and just built their houses. Okay. This is what you see over here. Now, in the process, what happened was, as the speakers this morning mentioned, and I was amazed, that's true. The so-called urban planning, even if you had it, we have none there, just considers housing. Because these are civil engineers doing all the planning. No thought of waste, no thought of water supply, no thought of where the flood drains will go, and so on and so forth. So what you essentially had over here was that people bought these plots, built their houses. And because it was the previous rice field, they just dug a well in there and could get their water supply. Of course, they threw the waste out on the streets. Now, what you are seeing over here, the picture on the left, that used to be the Chakhunja Khola. It's a river, a tributary of the Bagmati, paved over completely to make the main road. Okay? And on the right, you see its confluence with the Dhobikhola, okay, where it has been confined to 2 Hume pipes with a road on top. Now, what happens here is before, when it was paddy field, the rain collected and pooled in the paddy and slowly infiltrated into the ground, recharging the groundwater. Now, when you build houses, there's no pooling of water, everything runs over, okay? And the drains also go in there at the same time, okay? So what you have is, yes, floods are increasing, but God, it's not because of climate change. Climate change impact is going to make things much, much, much worse in the years ahead. Rest assured about that. But it is all due to maldevelopment that we have pushed, okay? The rain just doesn't go into the ground anymore, it just runs off, and then the flood level is definitely much higher. So essentially what happens when floods happen, and this is a story every year, this is that same street. And huge political pressure on prime ministers, because this land here has houses that has current and ex-judges in the Supreme Court and elsewhere, current director generals of departments of irrigation and things like that. They all have their houses here, by the way. Okay. Now, they put pressure on the prime minister saying something should be done. When this flooding happens on that street, which was a river before, okay, children, every year we lose 1 or 2 children to the flood. They die. They get washed away while, coming from school or going away. This is happening every year. Okay. Now, this is one example of maldevelopment that we have pursued. I go to the other one, which is springs. They're drying all across the Himalaya, Nepal included. And we've been working on this for the last about 14 years. Again, there's a knee-jerk reaction saying it's climate change. The data shows that rainfall is just as stochastic as now as it has ever been, and does not account for the drying of the springs. And climate change has been an excellent political tool to actually not worry about the maldevelopment that we have caused and blame something else. And the beauty of climate change to a politician is, and I was in a 1992-97 study with Lord Desai and Robert McNamara and a whole lot of these luminaries on producing the 4-volume called Human Choice and Climate Change. One of the interesting things was that, climate change really, despite all the nice sounding words, oh yes, climate change is very important, you hear that in every COP, okay, meeting and so on, is really not on any politician's agenda, believe me. It's too far away. And they're there for 5 years, and they're lucky if they last 5 years, okay? Because in Nepal, we have had 26 prime ministers in 25 years, okay? So it's just not possible, but it's very nice to say, yes, climate change. We are doing something about it. We have this very nice policy. If you look at climate change policies of Nepal, you will find out you could straight away give Nepal a Nobel Prize. If you really look at the implementation and our massively growing fossil fuel addiction, the government should be locked in a dungeon and whipped every day. It's that bad. Now, how do you address this? Okay. So here what you have is springs are drying across, and there's several other drivers of maldevelopment here and now. The primary one being misuse of this newfangled boring technology. People are boring away, pumping away to glory. It's the same story in Mehsana in Gujarat and all that. And here, it is essentially, drying up of springs is essentially a groundwater problem. Because springs are really groundwater storage that is leaking from these water towers called mountains, okay? Now, as a result, the tragedy is we are having entire villages being depopulated because there is no water. Food, you consume how many? A kilo and a half food every day? You can carry that. Water, you need at least 40 liters per capita per day in rural settings. That's 40 kilograms. You can't carry 40 kilograms every day. Okay, it's very difficult. Changing mores. We used to have a cultural concept in the villages of Nepal called basi pani, stale water. The problem with basi pani was that, if you needed 6 pots of water, you carried 6 because the 7th pot would stay overnight, and water that stayed overnight was basi, polluted. You could wash with that, but you couldn't cook your rice. It was impure, and you could not do your puja and ceremonies with that. So you didn't carry that extra water to stay overnight. Now with electrical pumping and these, black tanks overhead and all that, forget it, that concept has gone out of the window, the cultural concept. Okay. So we pump away to glory, and as you pump away, the springs sort of dry up. Here is a water tower. Now, Himalayas, another misconception, come from development west. Oh, the third pole, Himalayas, the biggest ice and all that thing, glaciers melting. Listen, very few people live where there are glaciers, okay? People live in the mid-hills, and mid-hills does not even get snow, except once in 10 years, maybe rarely, okay? So what you have is rain, that monsoon rain, which fills up that water tower. And interestingly, in the language, if you go to the local languages like Nepali, you find out that the words they use, for springs is so different. There are permanent springs, Sthai Mool. There is Asare Mool, the July spring that comes alive in July. Okay, permanent mools, July springs that come alive in July, and August springs, Saune Mool. If the Saune Mool comes alive, that means your winter crop is going to be good because the mountain is really filled up with water. It doesn't fill up every year. Okay, which means your dry season flow is going to be much higher. And these are traditional wisdoms that we have completely forgotten. Okay. So these mountain towers, now when you have pumping, massive pumping going on, either at the valley bottom, or God forbid what we are now having is fancy resorts on top of mountains. You can't build resorts on valley bottoms, nobody sees the mountains. So very rich people are buying up, these hilltops and building fancy resorts for tourists and all that. Water as a property, it doesn't stay uphill, it goes downhill. So there's no water there. And if you have tourists, you need all these flush toilets and you need all these fancy things. So what are they doing? They're either buying out all the springs around from other villages, or even worse, there's a case where an entrepreneur has drilled 350 meters from the top of the mountain to the bottom to pump away. In the process, drying up all the springs in between. You see, so this is where our maldevelopment is really leading us. Now, we started this process of reviving these springs by, community work. But these cannot be done, and this is my experience, both as a minister and as a researcher. Spring revival cannot be done by the national government. It's too big. It cannot be done by the state, or as we call it, the district governments in Nepal. It cannot even be done by the village councils, the village panchayat or the village development committees as we call them. It's too big. It has to be done hamlet by hamlet at ward levels. Okay. The problem is there is no support for that. Now, all that can be done is actually mobilizing the community, as you see there, with voluntary labor. And once the ponds were rehabilitated, and we have many examples of that, the springs below came back to life. Okay. But this is a massive exercise. It's not very costly. But the policies cannot come from the national government because the vision and the political imperatives are just not there for that. It has to come from the bottom. Now, this is a cartoon done by a Nepali cartoonist based on our research in South Nepal, Gujarat, Rajasthan, and Tamil Nadu. Okay. You see, there's groundwater overdraft. On the bottom left-hand corner, you've got this entrepreneur farmer who's got all the money. So he's pumping away, and everybody else's well is drying up. Okay, so groundwater is drying up, is disappearing. What are the social responses? The entrepreneur kind of rich farmer doesn't care. I pump away, I grow strawberries, I make a lot of money, No. The activist, the government, the village patwari type on the upper right, he thinks rules and regulations are needed, I think India has really not got a proper groundwater law as yet, It's near impossible, as I told you why, okay? It's necessary, but it's not going to be the holy grail solution for sure. And then on the bottom right, you have this activist, angry young man who thinks the government is really stupid, the neighbor is greedy, okay? But that's what activism is all about, an expression of values that is different from profit on one side and control on the other side. Okay, I was very pleased with that book yesterday. Again, I mentioned Nilkani book yesterday, Rohin Nilkani, Bazar, Sarkar, or Samaj. Okay, now this is exactly what you have here. This is what cultural theory is saying. You have all three social solidarities, as we call them, in place, from the village commons right to the global commons of climate change. So, now, this is where they have to be brought in. But as you can see, the fourth solidarity is the fatalized voters and consumers. They're important. They only react back. They do not actively cognize and strategize. So we take only the other three. As you can see, water suddenly becomes not just one kind of good. It's not just a private good. It's also a public good that governments have to regulate and manage and share according to rules. But it's also common pool good that activists value for other higher values other than control and profit, okay? Religious use. ATREE Dam had to be, shut down, and the water had to be completely released during the Kumbh Mela. When you have 100 million people coming to bathe at Allahabad and there is no water, governments could fall, okay? So quietly, with nobody really talking about it, the ATREE Dam stopped generating electricity and all the waters were released for the Kumbh. Now, this is what we call you have heard of E-flow, environmental flow. I have argued for the need for S-flow, spiritual flows. With the Mekong, we saw that. Mekong has exactly a similar history as the Ganga, and both Mekong and the Ganga are civilizational rivers. Interestingly, you may not know, I have an article in Seminaryo Delhi magazine on this. You can Google and get it. But the word Mekong, do you know where it comes from? It comes from the ancient Khmer word called Mai Hong Ha. And guess where that comes from? Ma Ganga. So these are civilizational rivers, and all our rivers are civilizational rivers. So we have to talk about, well, electricity, all right, irrigation, all right, E-flows for the aquatic animals, all right, but also S-flows. So there's a massive need to pluralize our policy terrain. Now, here is technology. This is that same small river called Tinau in Nepal. It's called the Rohini when it goes down to Gorakhpur. Rohini is the first river with the first water conflict mediation 2,500 years ago by the Buddha himself, between these two clans, his mother's clan and his father's clan, that lived on two sides of the Rohini River in what is now the Butwal area of Nepal. Okay. Now, here you see on the upper left a technology that's traditionally used even in the hills in India. It's brushwood dam. You don't need water in the monsoon. There's too much water. Everybody wants it out. But during the dry season, the Chaitra season for growing rice in the dry season, you need that water. What do? They build this brushwood dam. It's a community-led technology. Come the monsoon, the dam is washed off. Excellent, ideal environmental dam, disposable organic dam. You can't think of a better dam than that. But then it requires heavy community involvement and volunteerism. It's a scarce thing, because a laborer could get easily on that hill behind. You see, it's the town of Tansen. If he goes and works there, he earn about 500 rupees a day. Why would he volunteer? Okay, so managers have to do something. So they come to the Department of Irrigation, where fancy engineers with fancy degrees from abroad like me work, and we have been taught only cement technology. People from Roorkee here, and I've gone all around India and in the US and Thailand and all sorts of places. I have not found that technology taught anywhere. We are taught cement, period. Water engineering is cement engineering. Okay? As a result, this other dam was built there, as you see on the right. Interestingly, I should say, I can confess over here, it was built in '61 by Indian Aid Mission in Nepal. As Mother Nature would have it, she decided to just, in one big flood, move to the right. And the entire dam stood there 30 years, high and dry, a tribute to man's stupidity. Okay? And the area that it was supposed to serve descended into a dacoit-infested area. Why? Because the old system had been destroyed, the new one didn't work. Similar to what happened in Somalia coastline. The American bombing of that coastline and all that meant the state collapsed. And these fishermen who could fish for fish, could no longer do that because Europeans were coming and dumping their waste on the Somali. So the fishing died away. So what did they do? Their skills is fishing. They have no other skills. So they started fishing for bigger fish, tankers. They earned a lot more money. One big fish like an oil tanker would give you $6 million in ransom, whereas, your fish would get you something in the market, a couple of dirhams, I think, Anyway, so what happened was eventually the market technology entered. You see at the bottom left, the Kirloskar pump. If you can't buy one will come to you on a bullock cart at 50 rupees an hour. So you see three types of technologies trying to solve the same problem. Cultural theory would say, Bazar, Samaj, and Sarkar. Sarkari technology on the right with the dam, the communities, Samaj technology there, and then the Bazar technology. Point is, which is right? None and all, what cultural theory says, depending on the situation. But each one comes with its own problems. Now there's an over pumping of groundwater, and we're destroying a lot of things. Okay. Now, this is cultural theory in a nutshell, the three-legged policy stool. Leave the fatalists, voters and the consumers out for a while. You find out that you have these three policy proclivities or organizing styles, as we call them, everywhere, from village commons, to, as I said, to the global commons of climate change. And you see that they have very different response to any problem. Okay, the market is a risk taker; they take risk to make profit. The activists are risk sensitizers or risk amplifiers. Their job is to make a lot of noise. They're the canaries in the mine. Okay, if even a small danger, they will blow it up. And they say, "Oh, these are really alarmist," but that's their job. Okay, and of course you have a sarkar which has to manage both of them. This works if the policy terrain, as we call it, is pluralized. Each voice has a place in the table and is not only heard but also responded to. And this is where the Nexus theory comes in. Wow, I'm running out. Okay, so this is where Nexus comes in, because Nexus is a successor to integrated water resource management. And in Nexus, what is really important, I'll quickly say this, because what we argue in the Nexus is integrated water resource management is only about water. And it got so procedurally fetishized that departments just use this as like climate change, okay? But Nexus on water, energy, food means you bring in these other things also at the same time. It's not only water, but more. It's also politics at every link of the supply chain of each one of these things. Let's not ignore politics. It's real, it's there, it's what drives everything, okay? And in Nexus, one of the most important thing for us is that it is problem feeding. It is not solution proffering. Each one of the solidarities would have to proffer their take on the problem. Okay, the river in Bagmati is polluted. What is the problem? Is it a chemical problem? Is it a legal problem? Is it an urban management failure problem? Each one will define it differently. So each one has to be heard. And you can see that in cultural theory, we go around and we define that each four of them has a very different perspective on development, on risk, on technology, on justice. Every one is different. So a pluralized policy terrain, which is democratic enough and has space for all the voices, but not just space, but they are responded to. So if the market comes out with a solution, I as an activist or I as a government have to respond to that and say why I think that has problems. So if a consensus can come in, 20, 40, 50%, 60%, whatever is agreed on, that is a clumsy solution. That is stable. Otherwise, you're going to go into neat solutions that will collapse, okay? So I would, this is another one from the cultural theory. We are not just international treaties, not just international treaties like this on the left that states have treaties. They don't work. They're too neat. What really happens in real life, whether it is treaties or even national laws, if they have been done like this with these cross-cutting solidarities, like I'm a member of a scientific community, okay, I'm a Nepali, okay, but you see, what matters to me is more what my scientific colleagues in, in India, in America, in Europe and all think, rather than what my minister thinks in Nepal currently. We have these cross-cutting, solidarities and alliances, multinational corporations, NGOs, and all this. If a consensus has been arrived at, as did with Ozone Treaty, it worked, it succeeded, and it's giving wonderful results. If that is not there, and is a unitary monistic solution by nation states or departments of governments or even markets and all that, then what will happen is that there'll be neat solutions that will collapse, like the climate treaty. Whether it's Kyoto or Paris, it's not gone anywhere. So the problem is, again, the water sector. I'll close with this because I think I'm running out of time, but we need to go back to different colors of water. And I'm thankful to, Shreya Nath this morning. You brought out this yellow water, which I'd never thought of. But to me, it's gray and black water. Apparently, that can be given a rainbow color also. And we have to develop this. But there's 6 types of water. What we have done is there's a hegemony of blue water, transboundary water. That's all the resources are there. No, sorry. we really have to worry about white water, the sky rivers as we call them. In the Amazon, the sky rivers bring more rain than there is in the Amazon itself, and takes it to remote parts of Peruvian deserts that the Amazon can never go to. Okay? Then that falls and becomes green water on which our entire wildlife, our entire forest, everything, and dryland agriculture is dependent. Very little study of these things. And we're just too concerned with the hegemony of blue waters. Now, that green water becomes brown water as groundwater, which we are mismanaging to death. Okay? And then, of course, the waters that we use, gray water, which is organic and kitchen waste and all that, and black water, which is industrial. And we really have to think about what can be done here, okay, instead of externalizing the costs. Okay? So as a result, we argue, and I'll close with these, that the new environmentalism has to come to this whole concept of footprints now. Okay? What are footprints? A cup of coffee you had this morning has 140 liters of water embedded in it before that cup of coffee came to you. You can look at the numbers here. For chicken, how much, for 3,000 liters or something. For steel, aluminum, it's massive. So what and you can go further, and you find for agriculture produce, these numbers have to be done for each city and each state and each locality, each eco-zone, okay? How much of your production came from blue water, green water, brown water, or whatever? A green-fed organic chicken, roaming, has very little water footprint compared to a battery-fed, boiler chicken, as we call them, okay? So what we need to do with the new environmentalism is come back to this issue of water and energy footprints. Why I say this is a very important political point, especially for India, is this. Right now there's this climate change debate. Oh, India and China have become two of the biggest polluters now, in CO2. Hey, wait a minute. If you take that into per capita, India and China are nowhere, number one. Number two, if you take cumulative emissions so far, India and China are still nowhere. Okay, it's US. Okay, so this is politics here. Now, what we are arguing now, one step further with Nexus and with the footprint idea, is that we should go for consumption. CO2 emission per consumption. Because much of the Chinese production is actually American consumption, American and EU consumption. So are you going to blame the Chinese and the Indians, or are you going to blame the Thais, or are you going to blame the Americans and the EUs for over-consuming? So new environmentalism is going to be precisely in these areas. And I'll close with a slide which basically tells that the Dharma triangle of the state, market, and civic movements should have been the black triangle. State as trustees, not licensed Raj, as you can see in the distorted triangle. Markets as genuine, competitive, and free information and so on and so forth, and not the crony capitalism that we are seeing of going in cahoots with the politicians and raking in the moolah. Okay, and NGOs and activist groups also becoming real activists, not what we call pongos, bongos, gongos, and dongos. Now you may ask what they are. Gongos are government-organized NGOs. Dongos are donor-organized NGOs. Worst in Nepal right now are pongos, political party-organized NGOs. 80% of Nepali NGOs are practically, quote-unquote, owned by the Nepal Communist Party, UML. The other 20% are owned by a daughter of a prime minister and a wife of a prime minister, okay, in the Nepali Congress. Okay. Now, these are pongos. These are not really voluntary activist NGOs. They are politics and business by other means. Okay. So what we have as a challenge in the environmental field, and yesterday Sharad Lele asked about this, saying, what do we do in the next 25 years? My answer, wicked problems, uncomfortable knowledge, clumsy solutions, finding that via footprints, the Nexus approach, and essentially coming back to restoring the Dharma in this Dharma triangle. Thank you.